Hello there, Flip here, and today, Xilonen and the beta are in a fight currently, and Xilonen is winning. She was unchanged in the last beta and now has only gotten buffed even more. But before we explain how, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. And with that, let's begin. Since our base kit hasn't changed much, go watch my other two videos explaining how she works in more detail, as well as her team options, as I don't want to reiterate the same things people have heard like hundreds of times by now. Though this beta has confirmed something a lot of people were going back and forth on, and I talked about in my last video regarding how our geo samples work. It states that the elemental samples need to be activated for you to get the resistance shred, and activating samples is only possible in teams with 2 swirlable elements, but also states that her geo samples will be active during her field time when using her skill, which caused confusion with people thinking that just activating would make it last for 15 seconds, in which case she could be used on one or geo teams. Otherwise they're only activated for her field time and basically does nothing for the team. But we now have that confirmation that as C0 she does nothing for mono geo teams. You just won't get the resistance shred on her. But if you're an Itto main, fear not, there are things that may excite you regarding her updated kit. So let's just talk about it. If you were looking for C0 changes, there's basically none actually. They nerfed her exploration passive so it now doesn't give movement speed. So for things people actually care about, first her weapon is even better than it was before. Now instead of capping out at a 25.6% damage bonus with 3.2k defense, it now gives a 36% damage bonus with 3k defense. So you need less defense for a stronger damage bonus, and this also applies to the wielder of the weapon. This came at the cost of removing the crit rate and damage the weapon gave to basic attacks, but that only affects DPS Xilonen, and even then I would assume not by a lot, and if he had to sacrifice that to give a better buffing weapon, I think it's worth the trade-off. What excites me the most about this weapon now though is its prospect on Shiori, because previously it would just give her a lot of defense, but now it gives slightly less defense in return for a 36% damage bonus, which makes the weapon a lot more competitive on her to where I can genuinely recommend that Shiori mains pull for it for your teams over her signature. It should just be better for most of your teams. Now the second change is more interesting as they slightly altered how her C2 works. For starters, geo samples are going to be active at all times. This means that even on mono geo teams or 3 geo teams, you will still be able to get the geo resistance shred, and unless Hoyoverse is just clip farming for the love of the game, I don't think there's any other way to interpret this. They also changed the geo part of the passive to where now instead of getting 30% crit rate, you now get a 40% damage bonus, which on paper is obviously worse than getting the crit rate, but I think the reason they made this change is due to Navia mains. I think Hoyoverse most likely assumes that if you pull for constellations on one character, you're more inclined to pull for constellations on another, in which case Xilonen's previous constellation 2 actually fucked over anyone who vertically invested into Navia, as her weapon gives crit rate and Navia C2 also gives her 36% crit rate on her elemental skill. And if you stacked both Xilonen and Navia C2 with the verdict, you have 93% crit rate. Good luck not overcapping. Basically this constellation did close to nothing for Navia if you had her C2, and then changing it to this was most likely a way to alleviate that. The only thing that sucks is that this is just a worse constellation if you have a C0 Navia or are planning on using a DPS Xilonen, as you now need her weapon and C2 to match how good her C2 was before for geo characters, but this does put the buff in line with how strong it is for every other element. So maybe you can call this a nerf if you want to if you don't have a C2 Navia. I wish they gave a stronger damage bonus if this was the route they were going to take, or at least something more interesting than another damage bonus, but I guess whatever. With all of this addressed, let's talk about the character that now benefits the most, being Itto. Because geo samples are always going to be active with Xilonen C2, this means you can play a team of Itto, Goro, and Furina, which for Itto's personal damage compared to mono geo, having all the buffs Xilonen provides massively improves his performance, and coupled in with the fact that Xilonen has pretty solid damage of her own, and buffs Furina who also adds to the damage contribution, this more than outweighs the need for a geo sub DPS on these teams, with Itto's damage alone being able to carry the team. Overall, this constellation is a must in my opinion if you want to play Itto long term, boosting his damage by 50% or more, which if you have things like Red Horn or better artifact quality, would make this personal damage increase more impactful. I do think it's a shame that you have to go to the Ocelot C2 for this, but that is a relatively early constellation so you can get this in a rerun or two. or just whale. Now that is it for Xilonen changes. She's only gotten better for dolphin/whales, and the only thing that got her by these changes really are her own DPS teams, as the GOC2 is worse and her weapon is also worse for her DPS build, as it no longer gives the crit bonuses. If you want a video covering DPS Xilonen teams, let me know in the comments. Now before talking about her prospects in other teams, I first want to announce that I'm hosting a competition on my Discord server. Oh my god, that boy! One of my friends is hosting a competition on my Discord server where your Raiden builds will be calculated and ranked, and the top 3 entries will win some prizes. And don't worry, constellations don't matter, only your weapons, talent, and artifact quality. So if that is something you're interested in, make sure you join, link in the description. It ends in a month on October 9th. Back on topic, I've been asked about how Xilonen can fit into Cryo, Melt, or Freeze teams, and how she compares to Kazuha here. And for Freeze teams, even though her buff uptime is better, for both Ayaka and Ganyu they kind of want grouping. Ganyu's burst scales quadratically, so the closer enemies are, which is helped through Venti or Kazuha's abilities, the more damage her burst does. Then in Ayaka's case, her burst is quite literally all of her damage in quite a small radius directly in front of her. If you don't want to rip out your asshole hairs playing her, then I'd just recommend slapping on Kazuha. It is not worth the struggle, therefore Xilonen doesn't really do anything there. But on Melt teams however, trying to use Kazuha here was quite hard and involved really complex setups, or it was just impossible to get good buff uptime for your Cryo units, as Zhangling applies Pyro quite frequently unconditionally. But with how long Xilonen's buffs last, even just using her at the start of your rotations will allow you to almost buff your entire damage window. Even then, for Wriothesley I don't really see this being a damage upgrade to his Furina Zhangling teams, as Furina does quite a lot of damage on these teams, and for Ganyu, it may be a damage upgrade, but you're bottlenecked by your Pyro applicators, as Dea's Pyro application won't work well on this team. And Zhangling is fast enough, but that means playing Ganyu Melt without a shielder, which sounds cringe, so I just wouldn't recommend her for any Cryo teams really. The same can be said for her in most Electro teams due to the fact that Chevreuse exists, and if you have a C6 Chevreuse, she'll just be better. And if you are pre-C6, then Chevreuse can still end up being better due to the fact that she generates a lot of Pyro particles. Now for both Aggravate and Electro Charge teams, she can obviously be used there alongside my glorious Queen Fischl, especially because her buffs are non-snapshotable, therefore your rotation especially in multi-wave will be less cringe. But once again, I'm hard pressed to act like this is worth running over Kazuha, as Electro Charge swirls and Aggravate swirl damage can make up a decent chunk of the team's damage, especially in AoE. The best fit for Electro teams I can think of is on Raiden double Hydro setups, as you're typically using an Anemo healer in this team. Xilonen is just going to buff more while also healing, even if it's not team-wide, and you also should be able to easily proc both Hydro and Electro Crystallize quite easily on these teams, so you don't run into the gene issue of not getting an Electro reaction. To be honest, I would just stick to her other teams outside of Cryo and Electro, being the Hydro DPS teams, Vape carries, Navia teams, and so on, as well as the Mono and Double Hydro teams she enables. If there are any other things about Xilonen you'd like to know, then tell me in the comments. I think it's pretty clear that Hoyoverse is not going to nerf this character, and I expect them to just round out her constellations more in the next update. This is probably going to be my last video on her in a while, as I have other stuff to make, including Raiden stuff and a collab between a lot of creators. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Xilonen's buffs, as I'd love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.